in getting things going. And not only are we starting a little late, but I found out that unfortunately our guest speaker has to leave a little early. So, but we'll make the best of the time that we have. And again, I want to welcome everybody. Let's see, a couple things before we begin. What County progresses. Most of you are on our list already. We will pass around the sign-in sheet if you're not. We're also going to pass around a hat and ask for donations, which are most welcome. It's not required, it's free. We did spend most of our money on the picnic. I hope everyone enjoyed it, and that's what it's there for. But if you want to see more events like that, and you want to keep this thing going, money just helps. So a few dollars,
somebody have coffee
that'd be
somewhere?
great.
Didn't have time to brew it.
What we're going to do is I'm going to try to keep the mic on, and partly because we're really needed with this relatively small hall, but we are recording it. I think that would help as far as recording it. You're hearing the speaker. I also have a mic for people sitting in the audience. One thing we have gotten feedback from people on is that often we don't hear people when they raise questions, and this way we can hear people in the audience better. So we will have a mic for the audience as well. The only thing you have to do is hold it close to you when you speak. You kind of have to eat it a little bit, which means maybe even like right up to your face and to be heard. But it'll work. And I had a whole introductory spiel prepared. I'm going to throw that away and just say, give a big hand to our speaker.
Thank you very much. I just want to try this real quick. Is this going to work for everybody if I talk like this? For a recording? So I think, all right, great. All right. I think I'd rather do this if we could, so I'm not stuck right there. Well, thanks for coming out tonight, and sorry everything's got started a little late. I just got a text. I'm good till about 7:40, so but almost got an hour, so we're in pretty good shape. And I really want to take more of your questions than anything else. I just want to share a little bit about what's going on in Washington and some of my observations being a new job, being now 9 months into this. But I'd really much rather answer any questions that you have, or at least do my best to try to answer. Everything going on in the last just month, you think about it, from continuing resolutions and trying to shut down government to Syria to everything else. I've got the feeling people have plenty of things that you might want to talk about, so I'm going to try to keep most of the time for that. First of all, for those of you who are in the 2nd Congressional District, thank you so much for helping to send me to Washington. It's been a really interesting experience already. There are a lot of challenges, and these are in really challenging times. And what's one of the big challenges we have is the Tea Party influence in Congress. And before I get started, I want to say real quick thank you to Mike Sheridan who got us in here. So appreciate that. But these are just really interesting times for the Tea Party. What I've said so often when I get back home and when I'm going around the district is we are literally held hostage by about 24 to 36 members of the Tea Party. There are still people who are Republicans that I'm going to disagree with on a lot of substantive public policy, but at the end of the day, how things have worked before is we'll negotiate and get something done. You don't have to compromise your values, but you do have to find compromise. We have to get something done. But with the current makeup of Congress, that doesn't happen. Because of that 24 to 36 people, and just to provide the context of this, there are about 4 dozen people who belong to a Tea Party caucus. When the Tea Party put out their version of the budget, that got 104 votes. They had things like raising the retirement age to 70, a lot of different things like that in there. 104 people voted for their budget. 48 people belong to their caucus. But it's about half to 2/3 of that group that are just the diehards. They want to say no. That's the only really word they have in their vocabulary. And because the Republican Party only has a 17-seat margin in the House, they have had on a couple occasions, because of people just saying no, occasionally we have to say yes, they've come and got votes from the Democrats. We did that twice for hurricane relief. We couldn't even pass hurricane relief with the Republican votes because enough people wouldn't do that. I don't know if we've ever really had problems in the past like that. The Violence Against Women Act was another bill that we had problems with, so they had to come and get Democratic votes. Well, the Tea Party has said since then to Speaker Boehner that if he ever does that again, passes something with not the bill passing the Republican votes, that he has to come and get Democratic votes, he won't be Speaker. So since then, we have had a lot of problems getting things done as simple as appropriations bills. So one bill that I don't think has ever really had a problem in the past was the appropriations for transportation and housing. Generally, almost everyone has a transportation project in their district, so they vote for the transportation budget. But with the current, what I like to call the Taliban wing of the Republican Party, the Tea Party, they wouldn't even vote for that version of the budget set at the numbers of Paul Ryan's budget. So they took Paul Ryan's budget for transportation, put it on the appropriations bill, put it on the floor, and they had to take it back because they couldn't pass it. Farm bill, something that really should be very nonpartisan. We couldn't get that done, and ultimately they had to split it in half. And just this week, not only did they originally want to do $20 billion in cuts to food stamps, they went this week and passed a bill that had $39 billion, which would literally kick millions of people off of food stamps across the country, and 150,000 people right here in Wisconsin. And one of the unique things about that, I just want to throw out there, just because in case you ever get asked about this, whether or not people need food stamps, the Republicans have been throwing up this surfer dude from California. I don't know if you've seen it anywhere. They're like, he's bragging about getting food stamps. Well, if you govern by anecdote, yes, for every surfer dude from California who's working the system, there are probably 90-some people of that same 100 that aren't working the system. Literally, of seniors, children, and severely disabled people who get food stamps, that makes up 2/3 of the recipients of food stamps. You throw in working poor, people who have a job but still can't get by, because you think about it, at $7.25, $7.35 an hour, you're making about 15 grand a year. That is not enough to actually be able to survive on. That makes up 92% of the people on food stamps. And then we take a record bad economy with 12 million people unemployed and millions more underemployed, that makes up the balance. So yes, they found a surfer who was bragging about being on food stamps, but to then punish 150,000 people in Wisconsin who aren't surfing on Lake Mendota or Lake Michigan is probably a really bad policy decision. So that's the sort of things we have to deal with. So I was supposed to be home all week. I was supposed to spend most of my day Wednesday in Beloit, down at Beloit College and in our office hours in our Beloit office, and being around the district like I normally do. And instead, I have to go back to Washington Wednesday because the Tea Party wing can't seem to agree with the rest of the Republicans, and they have to have a very public fight, and they're going to go do that, and I have to kind of be there to sit through it to see when they're ready to have us vote on something. So it's been interesting in that sense that the fundamentals of Congress are so severely broken. And part of that is why we talk about things maybe other than individual bills sometimes. Why John Nichols, I know many of you know, was just in Washington with a book tour of his new book, Dollarocracy. He and Bob McChesney, the two authors, were at George Washington University, and Bernie Sanders and I joined them to talk at that. And one of the things we talked about is because of that, that's why two of my first bills were constitutional amendments that I introduced. It's not because I thought I've been in office 5 months, I want to change the Constitution, but we can't necessarily pass bills in this Congress because even Republicans can't pass bills in this Congress. This has been the least productive Congress. But one of the things we can do is really have public debates about things. And on constitutional amendments, there's really some very, very strong ways that you can then organize from the grassroots up. And I just want to talk about those two bills because one of the things I really found that's been one of the voices I'm trying to have in Congress is really a voice for restoring our democracy. How do we make sure that everyone has a fair and equal chance at that democracy? Because if you don't, then you're going to have even more fundamental problems down the road. One of those constitutional amendments that I'm doing with Rick Nolan from northern Minnesota, who is a real interesting guy. If you get a chance, Google Rick Nolan. He served in the 70s in Congress, and he left in the 70s, came back. He's a fellow freshman right now with me. He's the longest gap anyone's ever taken, if I understand right, who served in Congress, took off, and came back. So he's a very interesting guy, a very progressive guy. And he and I looked at the whole problem with Citizens United. The fact that the Supreme Court made this decision. Now, we're not the only one out there. There's a number of provisions out there, but ours is the one we're working directly with Move to Amend that I know has been working in Janesville on possibly trying to get a referendum. And one of the things I really like about Move to Amend is they're going around and putting on local ballots in different states and different local communities. So it really is from the grassroots up. It's the people telling us. So it's not waiting for leaders to lead, but it's really people leading and hoping the leaders will eventually follow. And I love the idea that it's a very grassroots movement. But what that simply does is says that one, money is not free speech. And two, that corporations are not people. So only people are people. Pretty basic concept. There's a few other, kind of similar provisions that Bernie Sanders and others have, but I think we all would be happy with any one of probably a dozen measures that are out there. But it's really important because if we can't stop that big money influence, especially what happened to Citizens United, those really, really large anonymous dollars coming in, it's hard to compete. We were just talking about campaign finance. I've always said, when Mike and I were in the legislature, when Mike and I were running the efforts to get the majority, which we did in 2008, make sure that we got the majority for Democrats to be in charge, one of the things that we always said, if you outspend 2-to-1, maybe even 3-to-1, we could still win. Because we generally have the people with us and our ideas, the people are with. It's just when the funding really clouds that is when it makes it more difficult. And in Congress, I'd say maybe it's more like a 2-to-1 ratio from what I've seen with the races. But with Citizens United coming in, sometimes spending those outside groups more than the two candidates that you have in the end, then it's a real distortion. So that's one thing I try to work. The other thing that I put a lot of energy and interest into, and it's probably one of the things I'm most proud of being able to talk about, and we try to talk about it across the country, is a constitutional amendment for, it's a right to vote constitutional amendment. Now, this is kind of counterintuitive if you think about it. If you go to become a citizen in the United States and you take the test to become a citizen, they say, what's your most important right as a citizen? And the answer to that is the right to vote. But you have no explicit constitutional right to vote. And people say it doesn't make any sense. It's certainly implied in the Constitution. There are certainly amendments that block from discrimination from voting in the Constitution. But think about who wrote the Constitution. At the time, less than 20% of the people could vote. Male, white, property owners, over 21. So it's a very small subset of the population. So they really didn't think of that as a need, even though clearly society has evolved to the point that we think everyone needs to be able to participate if you're going to have that in place. What's interesting, if you had the amendment in place, right now, if you're in a state like Wisconsin, where we've seen them do photo ID and change voting hours and other attacks to try to really determine it's politicians picking who gets to vote for them rather than voters getting to pick who their elected officials are. That's how perverse it is to the process. But because of that, you have to prove you've been wrong in the courts by a law, rather than if you had a constitutional amendment, be just the opposite. A state would have to prove they're not wronging their citizens by implementing the law. And just since that Supreme Court decision this year on voting, and this is probably 2 months old data, so I know it's more than that, over 31 states have introduced over 80 bills to somehow limit access to voting for people. So this is the reality that we have. It's used as a tool across the country, and I just think one of the most fundamental and important things we have is that the one great equalizer, the one thing my brother and I have in common with the Koch brothers, it's certainly not our checkbooks, it's certainly not our business enterprises, but it's the fact that when they go to vote and we go to vote, we each have a single vote. And that is one of the ways that you can best ensure that we have access to our democracy. If you haven't had a chance to read John Nichols and Bob McChesney's new book, Dollarocracy, I strongly recommend it. It's a great book that, one, has one of the best chapters I've ever seen explaining campaign finance through history, not just the current history, but through history. I thought it was a fascinating chapter, talking about all the problems we have with the media in elections, and finally he ends with a number of recommendations, of which one of the main recommendations is the right to vote constitutional amendment. So if you get a chance, please look at that. But those are two of the things that I'm working on when it comes to democracy that I think is just one of the fundamental things that we have to be working on while we're looking at all these other bills through this dysfunctional Congress that's got this Taliban wing that we have to deal with. A couple other things that I think are important for us to talk about, and then I'm going to try to just open it up to questions. I think if we really want to take back the majority, pick up those 17 seats in Congress and try to hold on to the Senate, we have to do more than just say, hey, look, we're not them. And I think for too often we do that, right? We just say, look, we're not them. We may do this you don't like, we may do this you don't like, but look, we're not them. And instead, I think if we instead talked about things maybe a little more aggressively than we have, in an off year, which is 2014, when fewer people come out to vote than when the presidential cycle is, that's things like raising the minimum wage and talking about a living wage. And we right now have a movement across the country that's happening where people are going to these fast food places and minimum wage jobs and striking and trying to raise awareness about what their reality is. And there are some amazing statistics out there, but if you look at it, the vast majority, and we're talking like 80% plus of people who get minimum wage are not what you think or are told you stereotypically. What we're told, it's a high school kid living with their parents getting extra spending money. That's actually under 10% or 12% it might be of the total. People who are actually working and this is their income, it's closer to 40, 50%. And if you think about it, you can't do that in one job. So you have 2 or 3 jobs, you often don't have benefits. What happens? We all subsidize through government programs then benefits for these people that we're then doing. So we are all subsidizing some of these players who are really bad actors. And when CEO pay, I think it's now the last statistic I saw was 354 times the average employee. And when you look at Germany or Japan, it's more like 25, 30 to 1 is the average. We're at 354. McDonald's, the CEO, paying those workers 7.25, 580 times the lowest paid employee. So, we have this growing gap between the rich and poor. And in fact, the president, just 10 days ago, talked about how in the last, I forget the span of years, I think it was the last 7 years, but something in the last 10 years, the productivity increases, 99% of those productivity increases went to the top 1%. And the rest of us didn't see those gains. And I know in the last 45 years, the average person's wage has gone up a little over $50. And if you were the top 1% of the top 1%, your average increase was $18.4 million. So if you think about it, I tried to do this on the floor and I did it really poorly of Congress with a chart. And the bad news is they said it was one of the worst charts they ever saw. The good news is I got them to write all kinds of articles about income inequality based on it. But at that $50-some, that was 1 inch. And then you extrapolated to the top 1/10 of top 1% of the top 1%, their increase was 5 miles long. So just as a graphic way of looking at it, the problem is on a sheet of paper, it's not real easy to do that same graph, but it's really good if you get a chance to think about it that way. So, I think if we talk about things like that, if we talk about investing in infrastructure, I know the president said that he wants to do another, boost to recovery dollars to get the economy going. But when Mike and I, again, were in the legislature, you remember, Mike, we had, when I was co-chair of finance and Mike was the speaker of the assembly, we had a report that came out from the road building industry and the vertical construction industry that said in Wisconsin, 54,000 jobs were saved or created because of that recovery dollars, just in their industries, much less all the other money that went to education and other programs. We know that it saved jobs. And the day of the State of the Union speech, the Speaker Boehner put out a press release saying no jobs were created last time we did the recovery. Why would we do this again? Well, luckily, about 10 days later, Dr. Elmendorf, the head of the Congressional Budget Office, a nonpartisan agency that we all go to for numbers, came before the Budget Committee I said that. And I got a chance to ask them, hey, this press release just came out. Is it true that no jobs were created by the recovery? And they said no, up to 3 million jobs were saved or created because of the recovery dollars. So we need to talk about things like that. We need to talk about and not be afraid of the Affordable Care Act. I want to see us implement it, but also improve it. There are definitely things you're going to improve. When you have a big thing like this, or when you had Medicare, it was a bumpy road at the time. You have to realize you're going to have that a little bit in implementation. But does it change the fact that now someone with a pre-existing condition will have access to health care? That someone will never have a lifetime cap again on their health insurance? That your adult children can stay on your policy until you're 26? That you can't be charged differently because you're a man versus a woman for your health insurance? That you have the access to preventive care? Those are all the fundamentals that we support, that the public supports, that's going to give access to millions and millions more people to have now access to health care. In fact, I just saw 6 million people will now have access to health care under $100 a month. Some of the poorest folks that are going to have access. So we're going to increase this. Now, there are some issues that we're going to have on the implementation when it comes to a small business at 50 employees. That's one of the number that triggers things. If you have 49 employees and you're seasonal, sure, That's why the president said let's do a year delay on that one portion of it. But everything else we can continue to improve as that moves forward. And I would hope someday I will continue to advocate, as we did with the Progressive Caucus, to include a public option. I'm not sure it's going to happen with this Congress, but I do think we need to keep talking about that because, again, I think that moves us even farther forward. But those are the sort of things I think if we really have those conversations, we talk about the bad trade deals that have hurt the economy, that we were just talking about sending jobs overseas. We've got the Trans-Pacific Partnership coming up this year. And I'll tell you, I'm going to be in a disagreement with the president. We already told them the first day that the president's office sent their liaison to us, we said, look, you know, we agree on a lot. I'm here for you. I'm going to be on oversight government reform, this committee with crazy Daryl Lysa. If you ever watched it, don't even get me going this week. I got a real good story about it. Don't even get me going on him this week. But you know, I told him we're going to have your back. Everything but trade. Don't even, just so you know, we're going to be opposing you in every possible way. And we actually led the freshman letter. We got 36 freshmen to sign a letter who are concerned by trade. And the president's folks weren't real happy, but you know, we're doing our job because I think when you look at, especially in this district, and the manufacturing jobs that have left, I even, right before I left for the August district period, I had a chance to bring in 4 U.S. trade representatives, and I got a chance to see the combined bracketed text, the actual working language, what's agreed to, what's not. They wouldn't even let my staff come in with me. They wouldn't let me take notes. So I could just see it and compare. I mean, so there's congressional input on this, right? That's why we don't like fast track, because you want to be able to have say. But looking at it, what I can say without, because it's supposed to be, you know, classified as far as the specifics, it's hard to take a country like Vietnam with no labor standards and bring them into a trade deal with the United States. And it's going to be, I think, another bad trade deal. And again, I'll be doing a lot of work on that. So I think I'm going to leave it with, there's a lot more things I think that we can talk about, but I think we should be afraid to talk about as Democrats about reasons why to vote for us rather than just why not to vote for someone else. And I hope we'll talk about more of those things. And then finally, let me just talk about Syria for about 2 minutes, and I'm going to open it up to questions for the final half hour, I promise. Syria, you know, I came out pretty early against military strike in Syria. And let me share with you why. Oh, thank you very much, Mike. Appreciate it. Thanks. One of the things, when this first came out about the idea of doing a military strike, I joined right off the bat on one of the letters to make sure that they consulted Congress, because I think you really have to do that. To me, that should be what the law. The law is that you have to come to Congress if you're going to intervene. And so I think 188 of us did on that Friday out of the 435. By the time the president decided on Saturday, he would consult with us. And I think the president deserves a lot of credit because now we've established this precedent for future presidents that they should come to Congress. So I think that's extremely positive and very appreciative of that. Having said that, I also went immediately that Sunday to the very first classified briefing. I flew in and out the same day. Still got to a wedding by that night. They're late, but I made it all in one day. And spent 2.5 hours in there. We asked questions, and I was not convinced that going in pretty much on our own, largely, if not exclusively on our own, without working within the international community, was a good idea. That was a concern I had going in. And then when we really had a chance to talk through it about where the end game is, everything else, it was clear to a lot of us that the public's really, really not ready for this. And John Nichols put it really well. It's not that people are just, because I use the term first, weary of war, because we're all weary of war. We're also wary of war. Take that E out. And I think people don't want to see us get involved in a civil war in another country. And I can tell you, at the beginning of August, I was on the Israeli-Syrian border in Israel looking at Syria. And while we were out there, one of the opposition groups, and there's a multitude of opposition groups that don't necessarily have any of the same beliefs whatsoever, put out a statement saying, oh, there goes the U.S. and the Israelis and the Islamic Brotherhood working together again. All right. It's clear this is a confusing situation. And to think that we're going to go in with a couple strikes, whether it's the use of chemical weapons, the use of chemical weapons is reprehensible, but I'm really glad we've got to where we've got, because I think many people reaching out to us, I can tell you, as of about 10 days ago, we had 2,200 plus people say no, 66 had said yes. It was 97 to 3%, and this was pretty common in most of the offices. So the fact that I think we're able to work right now with the international community, which is exactly what the treaty we signed in, that 98% of the people live in the world in the country that signed that treaty, now you're going to be adding Syria to that treaty, and if this all goes the way it should, that's what it said, is you wanted to have to do this. And I think it's time that we start doing that, not trying to be the world's policeman on our own, and especially, I think we didn't look at all options other than a military strike. I think we've come to a fairly good place. We're hoping that this will work out, that games aren't played, and let me just leave it at that. And I'd much rather take your questions and try to answer things the best I can. We're working on a lot of other things. I'll try to, address anything you've got, but I really appreciate a chance to speak with you all today. And how do you want? I think they could probably do.
It was